All right, welcome everyone. We're into spring here. Temperature today, getting ready for summer, hopefully temperature monitoring. Our agenda today will have a number of Stroud updates. John's going to talk today about science of water temperature. And then next month, we're going to start to get into monitoring of water temperature and usage of the data at the local level. This meeting is being recorded. The recordings are always available at this website, and I'll send a follow-up email with the recording attached, included. Meetings are every third Thursday of the month, always at 2:30. Zoom link is always the same. Store that for yourself if you'd like. I do send out reminders for the meetings, so let me know if you'd like anyone else to be on the email distribution list. Just as a reminder, attendees of these meetings are generally from the Delaware River Basin, either working directly in the Delaware River Watershed Initiative or just working in the DRB, but not directly associated with the William Penn Foundation. And then we do have a few folks from outside the DRB that attend from time to time. I noticed Jake Lemon from Michigan, Trout Unlimited, attending today. Temperature, a very trout applicable topic. Stroud Center supports these meetings and our general support to community science in the Delaware Basin via EnviroDIY, William Penn Foundation Project, and via Seesaw, Consortium for Scientific Assistance to Watersheds, which is available for groups in Pennsylvania. These meetings are simply a time for us to talk about topics, have these presentations, discuss issues, provide some updates from the Stroud Center. All of this is simply to support all of us in gathering good data and using it for purposefully. Stroud Center team: Rachel Johnson, Krista Reeves, Shannon Hicks. Did I skip a slide? No, here we are. Okay. Carol and George, two key master watershed stewards, along with other master watershed stewards involved in this work. Stroud Center leads in the DRWI, John Jackson, Matt Earhart, and Dave Arscott. Our primary goal with regard to EnviroDIY in the Delaware River Basin is to support watershed groups in using the stations for their own local purposes. We are working with groups and continuing to evaluate the data and develop tools to better communicate and understand the data. Moving on to updates from the Stroud Center. Just a reminder that we have all kinds of guidance materials at this website, shortcuts to different sections. One of the updates specifically within that web page is that I wanted to mention today was the new tab for entering your field visit data. Just a visual change in there so that it's a little more obvious as to where to enter your data, your field visit data forms. And again, just mentioning that anytime you visit a station, whether it's to clean sensors or do quality control or troubleshoot, it is very much appreciated and recommended that you fill out one of these data sheets. You can fill out a hard copy and then enter it online as the ultimate goal, is to get it online so that it's there for safekeeping. There is also a new service request tab within this web page that you can use to request help on your monitoring stations. We have made this form simpler. It did have a lot of required items previously. Now it just is a much simpler form, and it just has a bit of basic info required, and then there's anything else is optional. and so we are going to begin requesting whenever anyone needs any sort of assistance, we're just going to request that you fill out this form. And it's really just to help us kind of have better internal record keeping of what's going on and who needs assistance. But it should be very easy. It's just a few spots to fill out in that form. We are still facilitating snapshots. These are gaining momentum. Salt snapshots, temperature snapshots. If you are interested in doing this type of work, please be in touch. We can facilitate, assist, guide you in doing this. We have protocols and other materials. Wanted to bring up today, Diane Huskinson at the Stroud Center is doing a great job with social media and communicating some of the work that we and others are doing. So if you would like to be featured on any number of different types of social media outlets, please send your pictures, your photos, stories to Diane and or me, and we can help to promote your work. Wanted to remind folks that the Stroud Center annual report is out. You can find it here. The first article in there was about about our community science work, and it features a number of different folks. Some of you are on this call today. And I also wanted to mention the Power Conversation Cafe event that is coming up. It relates to some of the work we've been doing in the local policy practice work group associated with this network. And that's with Callie MacArthur has been working with us on that, and she is hosting this conversation cafe. Ian's going to mention a little bit about this as well. But just go to this website if you would like to sign up for that and attend that. It's at May 17th at 6 p.m. So I will pass it to Ian, or Ian, if you just want to speak up, and I will flip through the slides.
Sure, let's just do that. So I'm Ian. For those of you who do not know me, I'm from the New Jersey Highlands Coalition. I work in the Lepacan Creek area. So we have a group of people who've been meeting to review how and where we can interact with the local municipalities and other agencies, and specifically how to use our data that we've been collecting here, and how to inform those entities on best practices. So we're a recent group. We created a short-term charge to help us coordinate our efforts. This past meeting, we went over the short-term charge yet again. Everyone seems to be in agreement with it. Basically, our goal is to use the data that we collect with our stream monitors as it relates to the various different elements that we collect. And we're trying to find interaction points with local municipal entities and how to best utilize those data that we're getting to communicate policy changes, whether that's going through land use or directly reaching out to ECs about problems that we're seeing in our rivers. We're really trying to focus mainly on the data side right now, and compiling a resource of a group of resources that volunteers and everyone who interacts with this data could then use as a way to learn how to best interact with their local agencies. So in this past meeting, we talked about a couple of topics. The first one was impervious coverage. I don't know if we've talked as an entire group about impervious coverage. So as a brief synopsis, if you have over 10% of impervious coverage, you start really seeing impaired streams. And one of the ways that we were trying to think about this is a lot of the areas have been built up past this 10%. So for those areas, how do we ensure that we can better the quality of our rivers? And the first thing is to implement better infrastructure, such as green infrastructure, that reduces the impacts at a higher level. So it makes something that is more built out seem as if it has a lesser effect on the river. And one of the things that was mentioned was working with the planning boards to create green infrastructure ordinances, which would be a good way to almost mandate that anyone install some of these green infrastructure pieces. That way they help reduce their impact on local streams. When interacting with zoning, we've received some good input on some of the best practices, which is utilize GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems. Some of the things that you might want to include on those maps that you're creating are the buffers, wetlands, hydric soils, and you want to overlay that on top of current zoning. That way, you get to show the zoning board or whoever's working with the zoning what's working and what isn't. But it's easier to catch insects with honey than vinegar. So I recommend, and we recommend, start with what they're doing right. Everyone likes to hear compliments, so if you can get them on your side by complimenting them on what they're doing well, they may be more receptive to making adjustments and taking your advice. We also identified some areas of local precedence that might be troublesome in the Philadelphia area. I can talk about that more when I am a little bit more up to date on what that entails, since I'm not in the Philadelphia area. But it's important while we're having these conversations to think about the different locations that we're at. And this is a nod to that in some areas there's local precedents that might be obstruct some of our goals. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you. And we also talked a little bit on temperature, specifically, how do we differentiate climate versus developmental changes? Basically, can we say that something is strictly due to climate or something is strictly due to development, since they're both happening at the same time? How do you decouple these? Another thing that we've mentioned is temperature modeling, which was used to address some of the climate concerns and the development concerns. Temperature modeling in your stream could be a good tool to communicate to your local entities that if something doesn't happen in XYZ, this is what we're expecting to see, and this is why we care that we've reached these thresholds, and this is what you would expect once we reach these thresholds. Some of which are human health impacts, right? Whether it's more salt that's being put into your drinking water, or other dissolved minerals, or HABs, or a variety of other human health concerns. It's a good way to communicate that. And then lastly, one of the things we talked about was, again, this conversation cafe. The current title is Putting Water Quality Data to Work Locally, hosted by Tally with Power. And that is on May 17th at 6 p.m. And right now we're sending out links to sign up for the event. And if you sign up, there will be a quick questionnaire that you have to fill out that tells us a little bit about your experience, whether you're joining for more information, or if you've had firsthand experience, which we really want to hear at this very conversational webinar of sorts.
Great, thanks, Ian. All right, any questions before we move on to John's presentation? Okay. All right. Presentation today by John Jackson, Senior Researcher at the Stroud Center. I will stop share. And John, if you want to share your screen and take over, we can go for it. John, are you muted or anything? You good?
How about now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. So I wanted
Impervious cover.
I wanted to bring this in just because Ian talked about it. Those of you who aren't aware, this story has changed relative to what most of you have heard. And the only way, and this is really important for the policy people, that you have the most current stuff for any of those topics that you are approaching. This is an image that's still 13 years old, but there's two things that come into bear here. One is notice there's range now. It's not a single line. It's not a massive threshold. 10% and the stream is dead. The second thing is in being impacted is different than being non-supported and being on the 303D list. So in their model, this is where you're becoming impaired. And obviously that's above 10. So those are two things to keep in mind, is how much noise there is. You can be at 10% and be in a fair category or be in a pretty good category. You have to be very careful about saying, this is what we're going to avoid, and this is the complications. Same could be true about temperature. Same can be true about salt. This is just about science changing. So let me close this one. It looks like I lost that. So let's. Do you have my screen now, Dave?
Yep.
My first slide.
Yep, got it, John.
And so my only point on that is to make sure you use Dave as you're developing your communication stuff, and that will lead to the rest of the Stroud Center scientists, to make sure your approach to policy is making use of the best science as we know it. And we can send you to publications maybe that will help you understand what people are talking about today. So I'm going to rip, and I'm sorry about that, but Dave took all my time. These are the three things I want you to remember. First of all, temperature is important to life, in land and on water. The second thing is temperature varies a lot. That's why we do not get away from just sticking a thermometer in a stream and we're done. That's where sensors and repeated measures are vital. It varies within a day, diel, seasonally, annually. It varies in different portions of the watershed, along the watershed. There are refugia that are vital when temperature is stressful. And if you don't know where they are, then you don't know they exist, as an example. And then the third thing is humans have really modified stream temperature already. Climate change is just going to make it worse, but rarely do we talk about thermal pollution, and we should. So why is temperature important? Exactly what I said: day and night, mountain versus valley, winter versus summer. Then we have our thermal pollution where it's controlled, like power plants and factories and big dams. A lot of the big ones we dealt with in the 70s, not all of them. There was a stretch on the Schuylkill we dealt with several years ago that in July and August was running about 105 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer in the stream. It was a thermal effluent. But all these quote, I would call them almost non-point sources, the habitat modification, small dams, deforestation, urbanization, stormwater ponds. They're all changing the thermal regime. When you put a stream in a pipe, you change the thermal regime. And then we layer on top of that climate change. One of the keys to life in water and why water and life are so tightly linked is water's really thermally stable. And that's why when you're at the beach, the water's cold and the sand's piping hot. It absorbs heat without changing its temperature. It has what we call a high specific heat. It takes a lot of energy to change its temperature, far more than metals, far more than air. So water can absorb 4 times as much heat as air to just change 1 degree. The other thing that most people forget is stream temperature starts with groundwater temperature, and that varies north to south. So I put Fahrenheit on the right, centigrade on the left, just to give you some idea. There's also elevational stuff, so you can see the Rockies here, and you can also see where the Sierra Nevada are in California as an example. Water also varies within a day, but the impact of that depends on the size of the body of water. So this blue line here is a large lake. This could also be the Delaware River or the Susquehanna. And over a bunch of days in the summer, it barely budges. Now these red lines are a small lake. And this is how it's cool at 6 a.m. and it's warm at 6 p.m. and then it cools down to 6 a.m. again. And the amount, it varies, depends on the size of the lake and the heat of the day. Here are those same data lined up on this graph here, just showing you days in a row where that warm lake is varying greatly, whereas the large lake is not. So White Clay Creek at Stroud varies all over the place in the summer, and the Susquehanna sits there 28, 29, 30, barely budging. So stream size has to do with how much change you have. If you're at a spring brook, you're right at the spring source, you don't vary very much. By the time you get to medium-sized streams, that's where your data gets maximized out. Then by the time you get down to your bigger rivers, and that's going to be down here 10, 11, 12th order, your diel, this case, they use the old term diurnal. This is unpublished data from White Clay and then regional data from USGS. This is actually out of an old paper from 1980. But these first 5 categories here are right out of White Clay Creek at Stroud. So size matters, whether it's lake or not, and season matters. This is the same situation, White Clay Creek, where A is the spring or the spring brook, and F is your largest stream, which is right around where the lab is. The interesting thing is we counted up degree days over a year. So this is January, July, December. And the amazing thing is if you're an animal living in this system, the number of degree days are almost identical, but how they're delivered is very different. It's constant at the spring or spring brook, and it's way higher in the summer than in the winter as the stream gets bigger. And that's just, again, what do you know if you only have part of the year? You only have part of the picture unless you're at a very stable site. So winter's colder than summer, large is varies more than small, but the net effect is the same. Now we know a lot about this from lakes because they stratify. So in the summer, the warm water is at the top in the epidlimnion and the cold water is at the bottom. And then in the autumn, it mixes and that turns over the whole lake. In the winter, it stratifies lightly because ice in very cold water is lighter than, should we call it almost frozen water at 4 degrees? And so effectively you don't get a lot of circulation. And then in the spring, it turns over again. So that change in temperature is just as important in a pond or a lake or even a reservoir. It just, the density differences behave differently than they do in a river. So this is another diagram that gives you an idea of how it varies seasonally and with stratification. So these are depths, and this is water temperature, January to December, and the air temperature is the dotted line, and the surface water is here, and then you go deeper and it gets cooler and cooler until you're at the bottom, and it's not warming up much at all in the summer. Same basic idea over here. This is a warm lake. Notice these temperatures, 30 to 10. Notice these temperatures go all the way to 0 and are bumping around here. And the bottom is only getting up to 10 degrees, whereas this bottom never gets below 10 degrees. So people have changed thermal regimes. We've cut down forests, we've fragmented them or removed them. We've taken running water and turned it into standing water in ponds and reservoirs. Urban areas have become heat sinks. Municipalities and industry have effluents that are often warmer than the ambient world. This gives you an idea of what it means to deforest. So the top lines here are deforested, the bottom lines are, and this is time of day. So 9 in the morning until 7 at night, and the deforested system warms up. In this case, this is the difference here on average over this time period is 3.5 degrees C, 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's significant. Remember, with climate change, we're talking about 1 degree or 2 degrees. We're already seeing that just by cutting down the forest. We're seeing 3.5 degrees. This is what it looks like when you're in a system like we see out in Chester County, where you can be in the forest, then in an open area, then in a forest, and then in an open area. And it's just a matter of how much is removed. So this is 90% of your streamside forest removed. This is 50%. So the amount of streamside forest matters. This is from an Appalachian, a pair of Appalachian streams. But again, look at these differences, 2 degrees or 4 degrees C, depending on whether you're 50% forested or 90 or deforested or 90% deforested. Same basic idea, same data, 90% deforested. The reference is in black. The gray is your treatment. And notice the temperature and when it's occurring and what's going on. And this is the total number of days. And look at how many warm days it looks when you've deforested. Now, if you put part of that forest back in, this is all streamside forest. Notice how much we lose. We still get a peak over here, warmer than normal, but we don't get these extra warm days accumulating. And that's just a function of not accumulating as much heat. So it goes up and it goes down, and we eliminate these extremes. And these extremes are what happens as you're accumulating heat. You just don't accumulate heat. It's the shading drops some heat back down, but obviously it's not enough to bring it down to the reference. The same thing happened with dams. So this was the natural thermal regime. This is what it is upstream of the dam. This is what it looks like downstream of the dam. This is a seasonal chart. So instead of peaking in July and August, it's peaking in September and October. So it's warmer and later. The pattern here, though, depends on how the dam is being operated. Depends on the size, and is it hydroelectric? Is it water, drinking water storage, things like that. Then you can have things that are really crazy, like hydro peaking for hydroelectric. So this is where they hold the water back until it's profitable to release the water, and then they dump it into the system. And this is just your CFS. And the difference from hydro peaking in this example was 5 degrees. That's the difference between having a very little water, so behaves like a small stream, versus a very big stream. They've gotten away from this a lot in the US, and they did it by retrofitting dams so that you have mixing towers that grab water from the warm and the cool area, from the well oxygenated and the anoxic areas, mixing them so that the release doesn't have the same impact. The funny thing about this is a big conversation in the upper Delaware. How much of this should they or shouldn't they do it? Because at this point, after so many years, those communities have gotten used to an artificial thermal regime. They have a trout fishery that didn't exist previously in all likelihood, or it was certainly not as cool and productive as it is today in the summer because of the cold water that the reservoir puts out, unseasonably cool water. So it just depends on where you're at. This is upstream to downstream on the Sacramento River, where you're looking at temperatures, and you can just see how there's different thermal regimes as you go up to 100 kilometers downstream of this reservoir. So reach 1 is here, reach 2 is here, reach 3 is here. It's picking up heat both from solar as well as air exposure. We see this in our backyard. This is a small stream that we've been working on for a while now. It's a tributary to the Brandywine. It has these 3 ponds, and we set up one of our earliest sensor setups upstream and downstream of this forest. So first we measure heated water out of the ponds and then cooling through the forest reach. This is what it looks like in the last overflow. So this is the hottest of water skimming off the top of this 3rd pond. We put in sensors over here as a thermal reference so that we could understand what this stream was doing. This is out of the Cheslin Preserve. This has wild trout. It runs cool all summer. Here's what the data look like. Here's Cheslin in green right here. This is why there's brook trout in it. It never gets warm enough to really stress these guys over the long term. It's close, and hopefully the trees that have been put in will actually buffer it even more. This is the upstream coming right out of the ponds. It gives you some idea of how much warmer it is. This is groundwater collected and then heated. But running through almost 900 meters of woods took a fair bit of the edge off of that thermal warming, but didn't get us back down. But this is a reminder for me to tell you, look at how quickly it gets back down so they're all the same. By the time you get to mid-October, this system, it's small, so it's not a big heat reservoir, has acclimated to the new cooling regime, and it's not picking up heat anymore. And it's not dumping heat. But the pond effect is 7.5 degrees. And putting it through the forest, though, takes about 5 degrees off of that peak. So we can remediate it if we can put more forest in downstream, but unfortunately, then it hits another pond. This is really common. These small ponds in these systems, this is a data set from a friend of mine working up in Massachusetts. These are different months and a whole bunch of ponds. These are all small. The dam is less than 15 meters in height, so it's not a big dam. And this is the temperature that is being, as how elevated it is upstream to downstream. So the average in July was about 1.5 degrees across a whole bunch of ponds. You can see them plotted here. Depending on the site, though, yeah, it's 1.5 degrees on average, but there are sites that are running 4 to 5 degrees. So it depends on the impoundment area to watershed area and the forest cover. All of these factors influence the change: dam height, volume, widening, residence time. So it's not simple. But what happens is the warm watersheds are just plain warm. But the cold watersheds, that pond can really push it up. So this is what it should be. This is where it got pushed in July. The difference between upstream and downstream. And it just depends on the site. So the heat footprint depends on this water volume, the velocity, and shading. But it's an important concept. The dam impact is decreased downstream because in some cases you're running through forest and you're dumping the heat. So when we talk about the impervious cover relationship or the land use relationship, part of it when you're talking about temperature depends on where your forest is. Is it streamside or not? So this is a simple regression. This is average temperature with impervious cover. And 10%, you're down at 2 degrees. By the time you're 60% on average, you're changing temperature almost 8 degrees. These are the peaks though, your average peak temperature or maximum temperature. Look at how much higher it is. So you're in the 10 to 16 degrees. So urban areas tend to be warmer. That's the island effect. Urban streams tend to be warmer than normal because if your air is warmer, your water's going to be warmer. Shade is your one thing that you can temper that to some degree. Shade on land and shade on the water. The urbanization also introduces piping. Those hard surfaces shown in blue are going to be warmer if it's been deforested. The standing water is going to be warmer. The pipes, if your stream is running underground, is going to be cooler. So here's a bunch of pipes. Here's your stream. And the question is, did they grab a permanent waterway? Is it grabbing hot water? And how quickly does it get to the stream? Every blue dot here represents a pour point where the storm water is entering the stream. Again, a challenge at dealing with urbanization is how the water is delivered. I use this for Philadelphia because old urbanization means streams and pipes. So here's the historic streams of Philadelphia. Here's what's on the surface today. The remaining streams are in these red lines here, and they're in pipes. That's true, and it started early. This is 1895. Look at all the straight lines for Philadelphia. All of the streams in Philadelphia have been in pipes for 125 years, if not more. One of the things that also happens when you're in urban areas are thermal surges, temperature surges. So you get a rain event where the asphalt is hot and you get a little spike in discharge, but you get this nice big spike in temperature. So with impervious cover, the number of summer days with surges goes up as your impervious cover increases. In other words, you get more spikes as you increase the amount of built environment, roofs and roads. What do these spikes mean? Ecologically, we don't know yet. Those studies haven't been done. This is another thing that people don't think about, but if you're working in an area downstream like of a wastewater treatment plant, that wastewater treatment plant can be adding heat. And in all likelihood, it's adding more heat today than it did originally. This is a study out of Japan where they took temperature downstream of this wastewater plant. This is 1965. The top of the graph is 2004. Look at how much warmer it's running in 2004 than it was in 1965. So over 40 years, it went from on average 17 up to 22.7, 4.5 degrees. That's just heated effluent coming out of this wastewater treatment plant. Without a doubt, there's some climate change involved in that too. There we are attributing it to heated household water. That could certainly be a factor. But now we know that by 2002, we were also measuring warming. And that warming is going to be a complication wherever you're at, and it depends on what happens. So low emissions model calling for 3 degree C change, high emission model 5 degrees C change. We layer that over geographies where if you live in Minneapolis now, you're going to be looking at, say, the panhandle of Oklahoma, upper northern Oklahoma, southern Nebraska, in the next 100 years. If you're in DC, you're suddenly going to be in Arkansas or in eastern Texas in terms of your thermal regime. This figure illustrates it very nicely. This is what it used to be, 60s to the 1990. This is where we're at right about now in this purple area. And then we're either going to be down here or down here, depending on when you're asking, 2060, 20, or 2080. So it just keeps moving south. It's hard to imagine that the thermal regime of Illinois is basically under the high emissions model going to drop us into central Texas. But that's what we're seeing. Same thing if you were in believe it or not, you know, the upper peninsula of Michigan. If we keep to the high thermal regime, we're going to be down here in Nebraska. So they've modeled that. And Ian mentioned something like this. This is just one study. This is the baseline thermal regime, May to September. The second line here, the fat one, is what happens with urbanization only. So that's what we're doing already. Then you add climate change on top of it. That's the line in the middle here. They should have color coordinated this. And then the top is the combined. So we're going to be looking at, instead of say 22 degrees or 23 degrees, with the combined, depending on the day, et cetera, possibly upwards to 30. So urbanization and climate change, or agriculture and climate change. It's an additive thing. Where in addition to our existing thermal pollution, we're going to be, and that existing thermal pollution is from deforestation. It's from retaining the water in dams and ponds. It's from the urbanization. It's from discharging waste. So we played around with the sensor data that we have. Mark Pepak worked through some of this. These are just 39 of the sites looking in the summer. And this is the range of temperatures from 15 all the way up to almost 24, 9 degrees under the same thermal regime and same weather in essence. That's a pretty wide range. Now, some of this has to do with location, elevation, but a lot of this has to do with us changing the land use. So here's your forested watersheds, agricultural watersheds, mixed ag and urban, and here's your urban watersheds. Just to give you an idea, there's just the progression. Remember, agriculture is not the heat sink that urban is, and agriculture doesn't store water the way urban does.
Hey, John, we are at 3:15 right now.
Perfect. This is right at where I thought I would be. So this is a whole new conversation for pollution reduction or stormwater BMPs. This came out of the Chesapeake, and it was a technical advisory committee meeting, and they talking about stream temperature, and they started talking about best management practices. It's heaters or coolers, where these things were put in to deal with nitrogen and phosphorus. Heaters are things that warm up the water, stormwater retention ponds, floating treatment ponds, vegetated open channels. Coolers are buffers, upstream planting, urban infiltration, wetland restoration, enhancement, rehabilitation. Things that dump the water into the ground end up making it cooler than things that hold the water and let it warm up. What they found in the Chesapeake, this is 1985 to 2019, that they've been installing about 3 times as many BMPs that heat the water, make it hotter today than it was yesterday, versus adding cooler BMPs in. So what we are starting to do is starting to advise people to avoid the BMPs and landscape amenities. deforestation, open stream channels, stormwater retention ponds, standing water treatment wetlands, on-stream ponds and slow-moving areas, dams and diversions that may be present, and installing BMPs and landscape amenities. That's your buffers. That's your upland planting, including over impervious cover. You know, they get credit for stormwater for putting in trees, but they should also be getting credit because they're cooling the asphalt. It's a cooler BMP. Agricultural and urban infiltration, and then disconnecting activities from the stream. Off-channel watering. In other words, don't create standing water for a purpose that's going to result in heat accumulating in that waterway. So this is about deforestation, standing water, runoff, and effluents. That's where our heat for small streams are coming from. And there we are. So I can keep going and talking, but I thought this is a good break. We can ask questions and possibly stop here and continue this conversation next month. Because the next slide, instead of having Dave putting a stop on me, is why is it important? And this is biology. So are there questions?
Yes, I have a question. This is Ken Jones. Thank you, John. You mentioned dumping the heat in the forest. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what's actually happening there?
Yeah, you're losing heat to the air and you're losing heat to the ground.
Okay.
You're just transferring it out, and you're also allowing quite often some additional groundwater to come in that is cooler.
Cooler, right. Okay, great. Thank you.
No other questions? Dave, what do you think? Should we keep rolling?
Yeah, I mean, we are recording, and that usually puts a damper on questions. So why don't you just keep going, and we'll finish at 3:30, and we can stop recording, and then there'll probably be a whole bunch of questions.
All right. So temperature, why is it important? It's about chemistry on land or on water. It's about inside and out, inside the animals, whether it's a microbe or a vertebrate. You remember, whether it's a microbe or a macroinvertebrate or a fish, they're all cold-blooded. They're all poikilotherms. And that means their body temperature varies with the environmental temperature. And that also means that temperature is controlling their physiological processes, because temperature can control chemical processes. But in the end, the key to it all is temperature affects distribution and abundance of species. And that's because it affects survival, growth, development, and quite often body size. And body size translates into fecundity or number of offspring, and that determines who comes on to the next generation. So here's an example of how temperature affects photosynthesis. When temperature is cold, photosynthesis struggles. When temperature warms up, you eventually get to an optimal temperature, and then you get past that and you start interfering with photosynthesis. You start breaking down the physiology. This is what we mean by cold-blooded. Your frog in cold air temperature is cold. Your frog in the sun is warm. There's more than one kind of cold-blooded animal or cold tolerance. We call them stenotherms if they have a narrow optimum, and eutherms, broad temperature tolerance, or if many of the stenotherms that we see around here are cold tolerant. So you notice this is their optimum is either colder temperature. Now that's not true if we extend it to the tropics. The tropics, we see stenotherms that are warm tolerant. When it's about ambient versus body temperature, a poikilotherm goes up linearly, a heterotherm goes up linearly, and then it hits a point and it starts stabilizing. It doesn't want to get warmer. A homeotherm, that's what you and I are. We're the same temperature all the time. So your mammals, your warm-blooded animals are up here maintaining this temperature all the time. Temperature is important to stream insects. Like I said, it can affect an individual. And if you're affecting individuals, you're affecting populations and you're affecting communities. And you do that by affecting survival, growth, temperature, or development time and body size. This is how it goes. This is development time, body size. This is growth rate on the right here. This is temperature. As we increase the temperature, they grow faster. We decrease their temperature, their development time, and they end up being smaller. So what happens is they may grow faster, but not as fast as development accelerates. So they come out smaller. It can reach the point where we can produce a mayfly that's an adult and she has no eggs. She had no energy left for eggs. So this is a simple set of experiments where we increase temperature, and these are constant temperature. This is survivorship. Didn't affect a thing until it got too warm, they died. This is development time, and it just decreased, and then it had no effect, and that's because they were dying. Adult biomass, it goes from 1.8 almost down, the smallest one again, 0.6, less than half of its body size. And these are the ones that have no eggs. Your growth rate accelerates until it's not. Your development rate, which is just the inverse of this, accelerates until it's not. The funny thing is overall, the number of degree days, the number of days times the average temperature is very stable, except at the extremes, either cold or too warm. That's where their physiology is breaking down. So it's extreme temperatures and the warm end, but also on the cool end. Now, this is a mayfly that's a summer mayfly. So it doesn't like cool. If we drove the temperature further to the left, there'd be even more negative things going on. And this development time would go through the roof up to 100, 120 days until it quits developing. We can send it basically into a stasis. Too warm, they die. Too cold, too slow. In other words, development time, suddenly it reaches a point you can't get a generation through in a summer. Too warm, too small, too warm, too cold, and physiology is breaking down. So we see the extremes. Temperatures impacting their distribution and abundance by changing survival, growth, and development. Now, this is a bug example. There's no reason why you can't talk about this the same way for fish. The difference is that there's far fewer species of fish. So it's not, we end up talking about salmonids. That's what this conversation ends up being about, because we have a much harder time talking about the warm water and cool water species. But the fact is that at a certain temperature, even your bass are going to be unhappy. This is an insect example. This is the number of insect families in the stream. So 50, 60, based on maximum stream temperature, average maximum stream temperature. So this is data from Ecuador and Denmark. So these high temperatures or these cold temperatures are probably Ecuador, and these warmer temperatures are Denmark. And it's so cold, there's only a few species there. They cannot tolerate it. They can't get their life cycle through when your average maximum temperature is 3 degrees. It's just too cold. They're just frozen. But you're picking up families as you warm up. And notice the number of families. So remember, White Clay Creek has 19 species of fish. This guy's study, Dean Jacobson, he's out of the University of Denmark, but he also works a lot in Ecuador, in Quito. He's talking about 40, 50, 60 families, multiple genera, multiple species in this diagram. So last thing David asked me to throw in, because there have been questions about harmful algal blooms, HABs. And people have been pointing their finger, this is a temperature thing. So I did a little reading. I'm no expert in this, but this is I found a couple of good large scale reviews. And my take home from what they found is well shown in these two graphs. This is nutrients, in this case illustrated by nitrogen. And I think it works well for nitrogen because the phosphorus gets absorbed, so it's harder to measure. The algae pick up the phosphorus. This is temperature. The size of the dot is indicative of the overall weighting of each of these sites for this factor added to their model. So obviously, nutrients were adding more than temperature. So they looked at cyanobacteria biovolume and microcystis concentration. It was best predicted by nutrients, then temperature, precipitation, and the geomorphology. These are all lakes or reservoirs. The summer temperature drives abundance. The length of the summer drives the cyanobacteria abundance. And the increased temperature may reduce the toxicity of the blooms in some cases. So there's a lot of noise, a lot of things left to be discovered about this stuff. But I just thought that there was a question, and in my gut, I knew most of this HAB stuff was being driven by nutrients, and that's because what happened in the Great Lakes 3 or 4 summers ago was tied to them tiling fields and then changing fertilizer patterns. So the pipes were basically sucking phosphorus into the Great Lakes and causing big algal blooms. And they ended up, because of a number of things, being harmful algal blooms. But temperature is definitely a component. There's no denying that, but it's not all about climate change and temperature. So the solutions to pollution, the thermal pollution, we have to protect our cold water. The more we have, it's easier to control for temperature. So if you start with cold water, protect your existing shade. That's a funny thing with a lot of the stream restoration work. First thing they do is take out the trees. And that means for who knows how many years, and that's if they put them in. Second thing is we need to reduce our production of warm water. We have to get rid of these small ponds. We have to disconnect them. We have to plant trees. And then we have to deal with the future. We cannot be permitting or promoting new ponds with standing water that discharge to our waterways. We have to infiltrate our stormwater, push it into the ground where it can cool. And then when it comes back to the stream, it's not a thermal polluter. So it's about avoiding the heater BMPs and installing more and more of the coolers. And the more, when people talk, and when you guys are part of conversations, it's just about asking the question, is this restoration or this best management practice going to heat it or cool it? It's amazing to me at this point, after so many years, you still don't have that conversation, even in trout country. And so this is just a reminder. Without this conversation, you're going to get a lot more heat just by the pollution reduction BMPs, the stormwater BMPs that are being mandated right here, right now. So what I started with, it's key to life in water. It varies a lot, and we're having an impact. And so we're going to have to remediate that impact. And that's above and beyond climate change. I think what we're doing right now is if we can deal with our thermal pollution now, we'll basically be much better off in absorbing climate change as it occurs on top of that. That's it.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, John. I will share screen and just mention we have mentors available. Be in touch if you need that. Next month's meeting is May 18th. We're going to continue the temperature conversation and go to monitoring and data usage at the local level, hopefully. So Get out of there. Stop share, and I'm going to stop recording now.